Being betrayed hurt, but being marked for hurting by the very person causing the pain changed my entire understanding of what kind of relationship I was really in. At first, that sounds like the kind of sentence people only say after years of therapy or after they have told the story so many times that the edges have gone dull. That was not how it felt while I was living it, while I was inside it. Everything still looked ordinary enough that I kept trying to save the relationship from my own suspicions. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation smaller than betrayal, kinder than betrayal, easier to survive than betrayal. The truth did not care what I was ready for. Cruelty rarely introduces itself honestly. It often arrives dressed as teasing, impatience, superiority, or the claim that you are simply too sensitive. That is how it looked in my relationship for longer than I want to admit. My partner was not only unfaithful and dishonest, they had become contemptuous of the fact that I still cared enough to be wounded. That contempt is what eventually made the ending inevitable. Hardest part to explain to people who have never lived through this kind of betrayal is how ordinary love makes you vulnerable in practical ways. You build habits around a person. You assume cooperation. You stop scanning every interaction for danger because commitment is supposed to reduce that burden, not increase it. That is why the early warning signs are so easy to miss. They arrive inside normal life, mixed in with shared meals, errands, bills, inside jokes, and routines that still look solid from a distance. By the time suspicion feels serious, your heart is already heavily invested in preserving a life that may no longer exist in the form you believed. What I did not understand then was how much trust can disguise danger when you are invested in continuity. Whenever I expressed concern, I was laughed at or dismissed. If I pointed out inconsistencies, I was told I was dramatic. If I grew quiet, I was accused of sulking. If I tried to speak calmly, my calmness was marked as weakness. There is a specific exhaustion that comes from having your pain treated like bad behavior by the person creating it. You start using enormous amounts of energy just trying to remain coherent inside a system determined to make your suffering look unreasonable. I kept minimizing it because I wanted the relationship to remain something I could repair with patience rather than something I would have to survive by leaving. What made it worse was not just the event itself. It was the way each new detail forced older memories to change shape. Moments that once felt harmless became loaded. Conversations that once felt routine became suspicious in hindsight. That is one of the ugliest parts of infidelity and deception. It does not only injure the present, it reaches backward and contaminates the meaning of things you once held with trust. What nobody prepares you for is how much energy betrayal steals before the relationship even officially ends. You start rereading old moments, checking your own tone, wondering whether you missed something obvious or whether you were simply loyal in a world that rewards people who hide well. That internal spiral is exhausting because it turns your own memory into a witness you no longer fully trust. I lived inside that spiral longer than I should have, mostly because admitting the full truth would have required me to accept how much of my life was about to change. The affair itself eventually became undeniable through messages and patterns I could no longer talk myself out of. But what stayed with me even more was one conversation where my partner laughed at how upset I looked and said I always made everything bigger than it was. That sentence ended something in me, not because it was the first cruel thing ever said, but because it confirmed the larger truth that I was no longer dealing with someone who merely wanted secrecy. I was dealing with someone who wanted emotional dominance too. Once suspicion became evidence, I entered a phase I still do not remember fondly. It was part investigation, part emotional free fall. I was checking devices, dates, receipts, and timelines while also trying to function like a normal adult. Every confirmation hurt, yet every confirmation also made me calmer in one specific way. I was no longer crazy. I was no longer misreading tension. The story was real, and because it was real, I could finally stop wasting energy trying to explain away what my instincts had been flagging for far too long. There is always a physical moment when the body understands before the mind does. My stomach dropped, my breathing changed, and the room seemed to narrow around whatever proof I was holding. From then on, I stopped arguing with the facts. I gathered what I needed, not out of obsession, but out of self-respect. Screenshots, financial details, timelines, the usual practical pieces. But internally, another kind of evidence was also stacking up. The loss of tenderness, the casual contempt, the little ways my pain had become material for mockery instead of signals to care. That evidence mattered just as much because it showed the relationship was rotting at the level of character, not merely fidelity. From that point on, I was no longer trying to decide whether something was wrong. I was trying to measure how long I had been living beside it without fully naming it. The scale of the truth matters because it changes the emotional category of what happened. Once you recognize contempt, the whole relationship reinterprets itself. Moments that once looked like impatience start looking like disdain. Jokes start sounding like testing grounds for cruelty. Arguments stop being about misunderstanding and start being about hierarchy. I realized my partner had not only stopped protecting the relationship, they had started enjoying the power that came from making me feel unstable inside it. That realization turned heartbreak into resolve very quickly. Once I understood that, I stopped asking whether the damage could be explained softly. I started asking whether I could respect myself if I kept staying inside a story that required me to deny what was already obvious. Even before I made any final decision, something in me had already started separating clarity from comfort. Comfort would have meant delaying the inevitable, softening language, and pretending confusion was still possible. Clarity meant naming what was in front of me without dressing it up. That shift hurt, but it also gave me back a level of internal steadiness I had been losing for a long time. Eventually, there is always a confrontation, whether you want one or not. When I finally confronted them, I did it without asking for emotional permission. I named the cheating, the lies, and the contempt plainly. For once, there was no stage left on which my pain could be marked because I was no longer offering it as a plea. I was offering it as the reason the relationship was over. That shift changed the entire dynamic. People who rely on your emotional dependence to keep control often look genuinely disoriented when you stop needing them to understand before you move. In that conversation, I learned something I have seen repeated in almost every betrayal story since. When someone has been lying for long enough, exposure does not automatically produce honesty. Often it only produces a faster, more desperate form of strategy. I also learned that closure is rarely given cleanly by the person who caused the damage. More often, closure is assembled privately from facts, behavior, silence, and the eventual realization that you no longer need a better apology in order to make a better decision. That realization was painful because it forced me to stop waiting for the other person to become morally elegant after months of choosing something much uglier. After the confrontation, the aftermath begins, and the aftermath is rarely cinematic. It is practical, repetitive, humiliating, and emotionally expensive. The tables turned slowly but unmistakably. My calm became difficult to manipulate. My distance became real. The consequences they had treated as theoretical started arriving. Access disappeared. Control disappeared. Their confidence changed into agitation because the power had always depended on me staying in the role of wounded person asking to be treated better. Once I stepped out of that role and into decision, their mockery had nothing left to feed on. That stage taught me more about character than the actual discovery did, because it showed me who I was becoming under pressure and who the other person remained when the lies were no longer working. There is also a social cost to betrayal that people underestimate. You start thinking about who knew what, who suspected what, and who watched the relationship deteriorate without saying a word. Even when no one intended to humiliate you, the mere possibility that other people noticed pieces of the truth before you did can feel like a second wound. It is not pure ego. It is the pain of realizing your private devastation may have had an audience long before you had language for it yourself. And then comes the part no one glamorizes: the paperwork, the practical decisions, the humiliating phone calls, the explanations you owe people who were never in the room when your life actually broke. Meals still have to be made. Bills still have to be paid. Work still expects your attention. Meanwhile, your mind is replaying scenes it cannot fix. That contrast between ordinary responsibility and extraordinary pain is one of the loneliest parts of the whole process. In the end, My decision was less dramatic than people imagine and more important than any single argument. I do not romanticize revenge, but I do believe in consequence. Watching the dynamic reverse taught me that dignity often returns the moment you stop negotiating with contempt. I rebuilt my life from there with a clearer standard. If someone can witness my pain and treat it like entertainment, then the relationship is already over, even if the logistics have not caught up yet. That standard has protected me more than any apology ever could. That decision did not erase grief. It simply gave grief a direction. Instead of circling endlessly around the betrayal, I began moving away from it, step by difficult step. Recovery did not begin with peace. It began with routine. I had to rebuild trust in small, unglamorous ways, by keeping promises to myself, by protecting my sleep, by speaking honestly to the people who had earned access to my life, and by refusing to keep confusing suffering with loyalty. That process was slower than I wanted and less dramatic than movies teach us to expect. But it was real, and reality mattered more to me now than performance ever could. A major part of recovery had nothing to do with the other person and everything to do with identity. I had to figure out who I was when I was no longer organizing my choices around managing their moods, their lies, or the fallout from their decisions. That sounds abstract until you live it. Then it becomes very practical. Different mornings, different habits, different spending, different boundaries, different standards for what gets access to your time. The rebuild was not only emotional, it was structural, and that structural change is what made the healing last instead of feeling temporary. My partner marked my pain until the tables turned, but the real turning point was internal. It happened the moment I understood that being wounded did not make me weak, and their mockery did not make them powerful. It only made them cruel. Once I saw that clearly, leaving became less frightening than staying. That is when I got my life back. I do not tell this story because I enjoy revisiting it. I tell it because there are people still living inside the version of confusion I once called normal. If you are one of them, I hope you understand this. Clarity may arrive quietly, but once it arrives, it asks something of you. It asks whether you will keep protecting a lie because you are afraid of what truth will cost, or whether you will accept the cost and finally keep your own dignity intact. That choice is brutal. It is also where a real life starts again, and that is the part I wish more people understood. Betrayal is dramatic in the discovery, but its real meaning is revealed in what you do next. Do you go back to sleep emotionally because the truth is expensive, or do you let that truth reorganize your life around something cleaner? That question changed everything for me. If you have lived through something similar, then you already know the answer is never simple. But it is still worth saying out loud, because silence protects the wrong person far more often than honesty does.